Hello everyone, welcome to Defense IAS Academy. The topic which we are going to discuss in this session is agriculture and food management. Let me introduce you with this concept. Introduction. Agriculture remains the most important sector of the Indian economy, whether it be the pre-independence or the post-independence periods. The fact is emphatically proved by the large number of people who depend on it for their livelihood. First one is the Kharif and Rabi. There are certain special terms used to understand the cropping seasons of India. The agriculture crop year in India is from July to June. The Indian cropping season is classified into two main seasons. First one is the Kharif and the second one is the Rabi, based on the monsoon. The Kharif cropping season is from July to October during the southwest summer monsoon, and the Rabi cropping is from October to March. Let us move further. First one is the land reforms. The official stance and emphasis on land reforms in India have been changing over the time in wake of the emerging issues, which may be seen in two phases. First one is the phase 1 and the second one is the phase 2. Let us learn or understand the term phase 1. This phase commences just after independence. All economies were agrarian before they were industrialized. Only their periods vary. Once democratic system developed, the first thing the developed countries of today did was to complete the agrarian reforms in a time-bound way. As land remains the means of livelihood for the larger section of society in an agrarian economy, the successful completion of agrarian reforms benefited the maximum number of people, thereby improving their economic conditions. To realize the objectives of the land reforms, the government took three main steps which had many internal sub-steps. And these are as abolition of intermediaries. The first one is the abolition of intermediaries. And the second one is tenancy reforms. Under this, three interrelated reforms protecting the land reforms were effected. And these were as under the tenancy form, regulation of rent. Second, security of tenure. Third, ownership rights to tenants. And the third main objective is reorganization of agriculture. Let us move further. Second phase, phase 2. The second phase of land reforms can be traced in the process of economic reforms. Economic reforms expose the economy to the new emerging realities such as land acquisition and leasing, food related issues and the agriculture provisions of the World Trade Organization. Let us move towards another topic under the concept of agriculture and food management is land reforms and the Green Revolution. We have heard a lot about the Green Revolution. Here I am going to discuss about it. Once the government launched the Green Revolution, the issue of land reforms almost got marginalized due to the following reasons. First one, there is an inherent diabolic relationship between the Green Revolution and the land reforms, as the former suits bigger and economic land holdings, while the latter intended to fragment the land among a large number of the masses. Second one is the land reforms were socially opposed by the land owning caste lobbies, while there was no such opposition to the Green Revolution. Third, the level of legislative attempts taken by the governments regarding the land reforms till date had almost no positive socio-economic impact on the country, while the GR was having all potential of proving higher yields of food grains. Fourth, the subsidized supplies of the food grains under PL 480 were hampering India from carving out its independent diplomacy, as well as there was always remained a doubt about the regular supplies of food. Fifth, international pressure as well as the suggestions from the World Bank besides the success of the Green Revolution from the countries where it had increased the yield of wheat. Let us move further toward the next topic, that is agriculture holding. The average size of land holding in India is continuously decreasing due to rapid and high population growth. The continuous division and fragmentation of holdings has increased the number of holdings, obviously of smaller size. Agricultural holding have been classified into three categories. First one is the economic holding, second one is the family holding, third one is the optimum holding. Let us go in its brief. First one, economic holding. It is that holding which ensures a minimum satisfactory standard of living in a family. In other words, economic holding is a minimum essential area for profitable agriculture. Second one is the family holding. It is that holding which gives work to an average size family having one plough under traditional farming system. In other words, family holding is a plough unit which is neither less or nor more for an average size family to cultivate it properly. Third one is the optimum holding. Maximum size of the holding which must be possessed and owned by a family is called optimum hold. Let us move further. The main topic under the concept is Green Revolution. It is the introduction of new techniques of agriculture which become popular by name of Green Revolution or GR in early 1960s. At first for wheat and by the next decade for rice too. It revolutionized the very traditional idea of food production by giving a boost by more than 250% to the productive level. Let us move further towards the components of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution was based on the timely and adequate supply of many input or components. A brief review on Green Revolution is given below. First one is the HYV seeds. Means these seeds were photosynthetic, hence non-dependent on sun rays for targeted needs. Second one is the chemical fertilizers. The seeds were to increase productivity provided they got sufficient level of nutrients from the land. Third, the irrigation. For controlled growth of crops and adequate dilution of fertilizers, a controlled means of water supply was required. It made two important compulsions. Firstly, the area of such crops should be at least 3 of flooding, and secondly, artificial water supply should be developed. Fourth one is the chemical pesticides and germicides. As the new seeds were new and non-acclimatized to local pests, germs and diseases, then the established indigenous varieties use of pesticides and germicides became compulsory for result-oriented and secured yields. Fifth one is the chemical herbicides and weedicides. To prevent costlier inputs of fertilizers not being consumed by the herbs and the weeds in the farmlands, the herbicides and weedicides were used while sowing the HYV seeds. Let us move further. Sixth one, credit storage, marketing, distribution. For farmers to be capable of using the new and costlier inputs of the Green Revolution, availability of easy and cheaper credit was a must. Next topic is the impact of the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution had its positive as well as negative socio-economic and ecological impacts on the countries around the world. We will study in India here. First one is the socio-economic impact and the second one is the ecological impact. Second, ecological impact. The major ones among them may be glanced in their chronological order. First one is the critical ecological crisis. Second one is the toxic level in food chain. Next topic is cropping patterns. The set and the combination of crops which farmers opt for in a particular region in their farm practices is cropping pattern of the region. Multiplicity of cropping systems has been one of main features of Indian agriculture and it is attributed to rain-fed agriculture and prevailing socio-economic situations of farming community. Next topic is changes in the cropping patterns. Changes in the cropping pattern. Due to various reasons, the cropping pattern of Indian farmers have undergone changes over the time. We can see them in the three following phases. First one is the pre-green revolution phase period. In this phase, we see Indian farmers going in for a cropping system which was primarily decided by the socio-cultural and economic factors. More or less, they were closer to being sustainable as they had developed through the long process of the trial and error process of their forefathers. A combination of crops we see being grown by farmers across the country with judicious mixture of crops till the Green Revolution. Second one is the Green Revolution period. Under the spell of the new agricultural strategy, more popular as the Green Revolution since 1965 onwards, we see a major shift in the cropping pattern of the Indian farmers. The main forces of change were economic, infrastructural and technological. Initiation of high-yielding varieties of seeds, financial supports of chemical and other inputs, together with the provisions of minimum support price, gave major shift to the farmers' choice of crops. In GR regions, we see a highly repetitive kind of cropping pattern with the wheat rice having predominance. Third one is the reform period. Another wave of change in cropping pattern comes with the process of economic reforms commencing in 1991, which brings in new opportunities together with the challenges in the area of farm sector. Let us move further towards another topic of under this concept is animal rearing. The economics of animal rearing plays a very vital role in the country. The agriculture sector in India is predominantly a mixed crop livestock, that is animals, birds and fishes, farming system. Animal rearing has always remained an integral part of it. Animal rearing, which includes rearing of cows, camels, buffaloes, goats, pigs, sheep, etc. We can also add on with this concept is, besides directly contributing to the national income and socio-economic development, plays the vital functions in the country. And these are as follows. First one is the supplements family income and generates gainful employment in the rural sector. Second one is the particularly helps the landless laborers, small and marginal farmers and women. Third one is the provides cheap nutritional food. Fourth one is the functions as the best insurance against drought, famine and other natural calamities. Fifth, it is more inclusive in nature. Sixth, promotes the cause of sustainable agriculture. Next topic is the food management. Managing enough food in the domestic market has been the prime focus of the government since independence. Meeting the physical target of food together with the challenge of enabling Indians to procure food for their consumption was also there. Over the year, we see the government evading various ways and means to handle the twin challenges. Once the country joined the WTO, a new need was producing surplus and competing with the world out there so that the benefits of globalization could be reaped by the agriculture sector too. Let us move further. Next is the minimum support price. Minimum support price is a form of market intervention by the Government of India to ensure agriculture producers against any sharp fall in farm prices. A guarantee price to save farmers from distressed sales. Further is market intervention scheme. The market intervention scheme is similar to MSP, means minimum support price, which is implemented on the request of state governments for procurement of perishable and horticultural commodities in the event of fall in market prices. Next is the procurement prices. In 1966 and 67, the Government of India announced a procurement price for wheat to a bit higher than its MSP, means minimum support price. The process being security of food procurement for a requirement of the PDS. The MSP was announced before sowing, while the procurement price was announced before harvesting. The purpose was encouraging the farmers to sell a bit more and get encouraged to produce more. Further is the issue price. The price at which the Government of India allows off-take of food grains from the FCI, the price at which the FCI sells its food grains. The FCI has been fetching huge losses in the form of food subsidies. Another topic is decentralized procurement scheme. The DCP scheme was operationalized by the Government of India in 1997. Together with the center from states also procure food grains from the farmers locally. Under this scheme, the designated states procure, store and also issue food grains under TPDS. The difference between the economic cost of the states and the central issue price is passed on to the states by Government of India as subsidy. The decentralized system of procurement helps to cover the farmers, more farmers, or we can say, under the MSP operations, improves efficiency of the PDS, provides varieties of food grains more suited to local taste and reduces the transportation cost of the FCI. Further is storage. The capacity available for storage of food grains as by 2014 was 727 lakh MT, comprising covered godowns of 567 lakh MT capacity and cover and plinth facilities of 160 lakh MT capacity. The existing warehousing facility is limited not only in terms of capacity but also to certain crops. The stock holding capacity has not kept pace with the increase in production and demand for a long period or time. Next topic is the economic cost of food grains. The economic cost of food grains consists of three components, namely the MSP including central bonus, or we can say the price paid to farmers, procurement incidentals and the cost of distribution. The economic cost for both wheat and rice witnessed significant increase during the last few years due to increase in MSPs and proportionate increase in incidentals as well as the other costs. Let us move further. Open market sales scheme. The FCI has been undertaking sale of wheat at predetermined price, that is reserve prices, in open market from time to time, known as the open market sales scheme. Next is the food subsidy. Food security system of the government has been aimed at twin objectives. First one is the provision of minimum nutritional support to the poor through subsidized food grains, and ensuring price stability in different states. Further is the next topic is the farm subsidies. Farm subsidies form an integral part of the government's budget. In the case of developed countries, the agriculture or farm subsidies compose nearly 40% of the total budgetary outlay, while in India's case it is much lower and of different nature. First one is the direct farm subsidies. These are kinds of subsidies in which direct cash incentives are paid to the farmers in order to make their products more competitive in the global market. Second one is the indirect farm subsidies. These are the farm subsidies which are provided in the form of cheaper credit facilities, farm loan waivers, reduction in irrigation and electricity bills, fertilizers, seeds and pesticides, subsidy, as well as the investments in the agriculture research, environmental assistance, farmer training, etc. These subsidies are also provided to make farm products more competitive in the global market. Let us move further. Further is the sugar sector reforms. India is the largest consumer and second largest producer of sugar after Brazil. Means the largest producer of sugar is Brazil. Agriculture and sugar and sugarcane are notified as essential commodities under the Essential Commodities Act 1955. However, the agriculture sugar sector suffers from policy inconsistency and unpredictability. The sugar industry in India is over-regulated and prone to cyclicality due to price interventions. Deregulation of the sugar industry has been widely debated for a long time. Further, next topic is the agriculture market. India's green market is presently regulated by the Agriculture Produce Market Committee Act enacted by the state governments. There are about 2477 principal regulated agri-market and 4843 sub-market yards regulated by the respective APMCs in India. Thus, India has not one, not 29 number of states but thousands of agriculture markets. This act notifies the agriculture commodities produced in the region such as cereals, pulses, edible oilseed, fruits and vegetables and even chicken, goat, sheep, sugar, fish, etc. and provides that first sale in these commodities can be conducted only under the aegis of the APMC through the commission agents licensed by the APMC set up under the Act. Let us move further towards the next topic, that is the agriculture credit. Three type of loans are provided to Indian farmers to meet their financial requirement. First one is the short-term loans, second one is the medium-term loan, third one is the long-term loans. First one is the short-term loan. Short-term loans are provided for a period of less than 15 months to meet out expenses of routine farming and domestic consumptions. This type of loan is demanded by farmers for purchasing seeds, fertilizers and for meeting out family requirements. Further is the medium-term loans. These are provided for a period of 15 months to 5 years to purchase agricultural equipment, animals and for land improvement. Third one is the long-term loans. Long-term loans are provided for a period of more than 5 years. This type of loan is taken by the farmers to purchase land and expensive agricultural equipment and for repayment of old loans. Let us move further towards the next topic, that is the sources of agriculture loans. We can say the Indian farmer can acquire the above types of loans from two sources. First one is the non-institutional, second one is the institutional. The non-institutional sources like money lenders, landlords, big businessmen, etc. Second one is the institutional sources like commercial banks, cooperative banks and the government sources. Policy of agriculture credit aims at progressive institutionalization of credit agencies for providing credit to farmers for raising agriculture production and productivity. Agriculture credit is dispersed through a multi-agency network consisting of cooperatives, commercial banks and regional rural banks also. Next topic is the commodity future markets. By mid 2015, out of the 113 commodities notified for future trading, 43 were actively traded in 4 national exchanges and 6 commodity specific exchanges. Share of agricultural commodities in the total turnover was over 18% in 2014 and 15, with food items contributing over 50% of it. Wow. The remaining turnover was contributed by bullion, metals and energy contracts. Let us move further towards the another topic, that is the upstream and downstream requirements. Upstream and downstream are business terms applicable to the production process that exists within several industries. Upstream, downstream and midstream make up the stages of the production process for different industries. First one is the upstream. The upstream stage of the production process involves searching for and extracting raw materials. It does not do anything with the material itself, such as processing the materials. In upstream, firms simply find and extract the raw material. Thus, any industry that relies on the extraction of raw materials commonly has an upstream stage in its production process. Further is the downstream. The downstream stage in the production process involves processing the materials collected during the upstream stage into a finished product. It further includes the actual sale. End users will vary depending on the finished product. Further is the midstream. Several points in between the 2 points, that, or we can say the place where raw is extracted until it reaches the final consumer as finished good, are taken as the midstream. It depends on the reference point as how many or which stage is considered as the midstream by an industry. Let us move further towards the another topic, that is a supply chain management. Supply chain management. A supply chain is a network of facilities and distribution options that performs the functions of procurement of materials, transformation of these materials into intermediate and finished products, and the distribution of these finished products to consumers. Supply chains exist in both service and manufacturing organization, although the complexity of the chain may vary greatly from industry to industry and firm to firm. Supply chain activities cover everything, that is, we can say product development, sourcing, production, logistics, information systems, irrigation, etc. Means it is covering all these things also. Let us move further. We can also add on, India needs the following features in its supply chain management. Just a second. First one is the unorganized retained sector. Second one is the proper levels of logistics. Third one is the fully updated data of raw materials, production, cropping pattern, etc. Fourth one is the international class packaging, care towards phytosanitary aspects. Next topic is the irrigation. Let us move towards the next topic, that is an irrigation. Irrigation. The Planning Commission classified irrigation projects or schemes in India on the following lines. First one is the major irrigation scheme. Those with cultivable command areas of more than 10,000 hectares. Second one is the medium irrigation scheme. Those with cultivable command areas between 2,000 and 10,000 hectares. Third one is the minor irrigation scheme. Those with cultivable command area up to 2,000 hectares. Expansion of irrigation facilities along with consolidation of the existing systems has been the main part of the strategy for increasing production of food grains. Another topic is under this concept is macro management of agriculture, or in short we may call it as MMA. The MMA was revised in 2008 to improve its efficacy in supplementing and complementing the efforts of the states towards enhancement of agricultural production and productivity. It also provides opportunity to draw upon agriculture development programs out of 10 sub-schemes relating to crop production and natural resource management, and give it the flexibility to use 20% of resources for innovative components. Let us move further. Next one is the agricultural insurance. There are various major crop insurance schemes under implementation in the country. First one is the National Agricultural Insurance Scheme. The NAIS is a government-sponsored central sector crop insurance scheme being implemented in the country since 1999 and 2000 season, with the objective of providing financial support to farmers in the event of failure of crops as a result of natural calamities, pests and diseases. Second one is the modified NAIS, means Modified National Agricultural Insurance Scheme. With an aim of further improving crop insurance schemes, the MNAIS is under implementation on pilot basis in 50 districts in the country from the 2010-11 season. Some of the improvements made in the MNAIS are: first one, actuarial premium with subsidy in premium at different rates. All claims liability to be on the insurer. Third, unit area of insurer reduced to village panchayat level for major crops. Fourth, indemnity for prevented or sowing or planting risk and for post-harvest losses due to cyclone. Fifth, on account payment up to 25% advance of likely claims as immediate relief. Sixth,
more proficient basis for calculation of threshold yield. Next, allowing private sector insurers with adequate infrastructure. Now the third scheme is pilot weather-based crop insurance, being implemented as a central sector scheme from Kharif to 2000 season. The scheme is intended to provide protection to farmers against diverse weather incidents such as deficit and excess rainfall, low or high temperature, and humidity that are deemed to adversely impact crop production. Fourth one is the Krishi Shramik Suraksha Scheme Yojana. The multi-benefit scheme for the agricultural workers commenced on July 1st, 2001, provides life insurance protection, lump sum survival benefit and pension to those who are between the age of 18 to 50 years, functions on group basis with minimum of 20 members. Fifth one is the Farm Income Insurance Scheme. The scheme commenced in January 2004 for providing insurance safeguards and economic security to farmers, run by the Ministry of Agriculture and Indian Agriculture Insurance Company Limited. Sixth is the Varsha Bima, means rainfall insurance. Introduced in 2004, Southwest Monsoon period covers all natural rainfall risk and provides 5 different options suiting varying requirements of the farming community. Next topic is farm mechanization. Agricultural mechanization is one of the main drivers of agricultural sector growth. Farm power availability and average food grain yield have a direct relationship. It increases productivity of land and labor by meeting timeless of farm operations and increases gross output per unit time. Besides its paramount contribution to the multiple profit and diversification of agriculture, mechanization also enables efficient utilization of inputs such as seeds, fertilizers, and irrigation water. Further, we can also add on, India faces mainly two main challenges in its stride towards farm mechanization. First is the highly diverse agriculture with different soil and climate zones requiring customized farm machinery and equipment. Second one is the small land holdings with limited resources. This is about the farm mechanization. Next is the National Mission for Sustainable Agriculture. The NMSA, launched in 2011-12, aims at enhancing food security and protection of resources such as land, water, biodiversity, and genetic resources by developing strategies to make Indian agriculture more resilient to climate change. Let us move further. Further is the second green revolution. Use of all eco-friendly means in cultivation is the second green revolution, or SGR, or evergreen revolution, or sustainable agriculture. For experts, it includes the agricultural practice such as replacing chemical fertilizers by biofertilizers. Second, in place of chemical pesticides, using biopesticides. Third, conserving water, balanced cropping pattern, proper crop combinations, etc. Next is the WTO, means World Trade Organization in Agriculture, subsidized AMC. The subsidies provided by the government to the agriculture sector, that is the domestic support, is termed by the WTO as aggregate layer of support. What they termed as aggregate layer of support. It is calculated in terms of product and unit subsidies. The WTO argues that product subsidies like minimum support prices and input subsidies, or we can say non-product like credit, fertilizers, irrigation and power, will cut production cost of farming and will give undue advantage to such countries in their access to the world market. Such subsidies are called to cause distortion to the world trade. Such subsidies are not permitted in one sense as they have a minimum permissible limit. They minimize under the provisions, which is 5% and 10% of their total agricultural output in the case of developed and developing countries respectively. Next is the export subsidies. For export subsidy, the WTO has provisions in two categories. First one is the reduction in total budgetary scope on export subsidies and reduction in the total quantity of export covered by the subsidy. Let us move further. Our next topic is sanitary and phytosanitary measures. The provisions of the WTO allow member countries to set their own health and safety standards provided they are justified on the scientific grounds and do not result in arbitrary or unjustified barrier to trade. The provisions encourage use of international standards and also include certain special and differential treatment in favor of developing countries. Next is the food processing. Indian food processing industries has not grown with the pace which we see in the developed countries. There has been certain reasons for it. First is the India has a lower urban population. Second is the whatever urban population India has, it does not have the typical urban food habits, as majority of it is second or third generation in the urban areas. They still continue with the non-urban rural food habits, detrimental to the consumption of the agro-processed items. Third, in recent times, there has come enough awareness among the population across the country regarding the chemicals which are used in the agro-processing industries, creating a general tendency to avoid such food articles, or we can say much damage has been done to the industry by the fast foods, adulteration in the food items such as sweets, milk, etc. Fourth, a wave across the world towards consuming more which comes on plant than what is produced in plants. A similar wave of slow food has gained popularity across Europe and other parts of the world, originating from France. Let us move further. Next is the human resource development, or HRD. The human resource development is very critical for sustained growth in the sector. Extensive training and entrepreneurship development is given top priorities. First one is the creation of infrastructure facilities for running degree or diploma courses in food processing. Second, entrepreneurship development programs. Third, setting up of food processing training centers. Fourth, training at recognized national or state level institutions, etc. Next is the National Institute of Food Technology or Entrepreneurship and Management, or we may call it as NIFTEM. For developing a vibrant food processing sector, India needs not only world-class food technologists to take R&D, means research and development in frontier areas, develop new products, processes, technologies and machineries, set food standards and protocol testing, but also business leaders and managers well versed with the requisite mix of technologies, management and entrepreneurship who can exploit major opportunities in the expanding global food trade. This is all about the topic of agriculture and food management. Let us move further.
Welcome to Defense IAS Academy. Our next topic is industry and infrastructure. Let me introduce you with this topic. Many of the Western economies have already written their success stories on industrialization, leading to accelerated growth and development by the time India became an independent economy. Independent India needed to rejuvenate its economy from a completely dilapidated state. The country had many tasks in front of it. The abject mass poverty, shortage of food, grains, healthcare, etc., calling for immediate attention. The other areas of attention included industry, infrastructure, science and technology, and higher education, to name a few. This is about introduction, industry and infrastructure. Review of industry policies up to 1986. For a better understanding of the Indian economy, it is advisable to look into the various industrial policies. The official stances keep changing with every upcoming industrial policy. Understanding these policies become even more important to understand the finer aspects of the reform process which the country will commence by the early 1990s. Let's have a brief review of India's industrial policies are being discussed to serve the purpose. First one is the Industrial Policy Resolution 1948. Announced on April 8, 1948, this was not only the first industrial policy statement of India, but it decided the model of the economy system too. Thus, it was the first economic policy of the country. Second one is the Industrial Policy Resolution 1956. The government was encouraged by the impact of the Indian industrial policy of 1948, and it was only after 8 years that the new and more crystallized policies were announced for the Indian industries. Let us move further. Industrial Policy Statement 1969. This was basically a licensing policy which aimed at solving the shortcomings of the licensing policy started by the Industrial Policy of 1956. The experts and the industrialist newcomers complained that the industrial licensing policy was serving just the opposite purpose for which it was mooted. Next is the Industrial Policy 1973. The Industrial Policy Statement of 1973 introduced some new thinking into the economy, with major one being as follows. First one, a new classificatory term, that is core industries, was created. The industries which were of fundamental importance for the development of industries were put in this category, such as iron and steel, cement, coal, crude oil, oil refining and electricity. In the future, these industries came to be known as basic industries, infrastructure industries in the country. Second, out of the 6 core industries defined by the policy, the private sector may apply for licenses for the industries which were not a part of schedule A of the Industrial Policy 1956. The private firms eligible to apply for such licenses were supposed to have their total assets of 20 crore or more. Third, some industries were put under the reserved list, in which only the small or medium industries could be set up. Fourth, the concept of joint sector was developed, which allowed partnership among the center, state and the private sector while setting up some industries. The governments had this discretionary power to exit such ventures in future. Fifth, the government of India had been facing the foreign exchange crunch during that time. To regulate foreign exchange, the Foreign Exchange Regulation Act, the experts have called it a draconian act which hampered the growth and modernization of Indian industries. Sixth, a limited permission of foreign investment was given, with the multinational corporations, MNCs, being allowed to set up their subsidiaries in the country. Next is Indian Policy Statement 1977. The Industrial Policy Statement of 1977 was chalked by a different political setup from the past with a different political favor. The dominant voice in the government was having an anti-Indra stance with an inclination towards the Gandhian socialistic views towards the economy. Next is the Industrial Policy Resolution 1980. The year 1980 saw the return of the same political party at the center. The new government revised the industrial policy of 1977 with few exceptions in the Industrial Policy Resolution 1980. Next is the Industrial Policy Resolution 1985 and 1986. The industrial policy resolutions announced by the government in 1985 and 1986 were very much similar in nature, and the latter tried to promote the initiative of the former. Next is the New Industrial Policy 1991. It were the industrial policies of past which had shaped the nature and structure of the Indian economy. The need of the hour was to change the nature and structure of the economy by early 1990s. The government of India decided to change the very nature of the industrial policy, which will automatically lead to change in the nature and scope of the economy, and here came the New Industrial Policy of 1990. The major highlights of the policies are as follows, which are under the New Industrial Policy 1991. That is, the first one is the de-reservation of the industries. Second is the de-licensing of the industry. Third, abolition of the MRTP limit. Fourth, promotion of foreign investment. Fifth, FARA replaced by FEMA. Sixth, location of industries. Seventh, compulsion of phased production abolished. Eighth, compulsion to convert loans into shares abolished. Let us move further. Next topic is the disinvestment. Disinvestment is a process of selling government equities in public sector enterprises. Disinvestment in India is seen connected to major three interrelated areas, namely a tool of public sector reforms, a part of the economic reform started in mid-1991, and it has to be done as a complementary part of the de-reservation of the industries. Initially motivated by the need to raise resources for budgetary allocations. Now we have some types of disinvestment. Types of disinvestment. Since the process of disinvestment was started in India 1991, it consisted of two official types. First one is the token disinvestment and the second one is the strategic disinvestment. There is a brief discussion on them. Let us go through that. Token disinvestment. Disinvestment started in India with a high political quotient in a symbolic way known as the token disinvestment. Strategic disinvestment. In order to make disinvestment a process by which efficiency of the PSUs, means public sector undertakings, could be enhanced and the government could be de-burden itself of the activities in which the private sector has developed better efficiency. Or we can say so that the government could concentrate on the areas which have no attraction for the private sector, such as social sector support for the poor masses. The government initiated the process of strategic disinvestment. The government classifying the PSUs into strategic and non-strategic in March 1999, that will generally reduce its stake, means shareholding, in the non-strategic public sector enterprises to 26% or below if necessary, and in the strategic public sector enterprises it will retain its majority holding. Let us move further. Next is the current disinvestment policy. The present disinvestment policy was articulated by the UPA second under its restructured common minimum program in 2009, which is based on the main ideology that first one is the citizens have every right to own part of the shares of the public sector undertakings. Second, public sector undertakings are the wealth of the nation and this wealth should rest in the hands of the people. Third, while pursuing this investment, the government has to retain majority shareholding, that is at least 31% and management control of the PSUs. Next topic is the investment challenge. As per the recent informations released by the Government of India, the concerns and the policies regarding the investment scenario in the industrial sector is as given below. First one is the gross capital formation, means GCFs. Investment and capacity additions are critical for sustained industrial growth. Data clearly indicate a moderation in the growth of GCF in industry. The rate of growth of GCF is in four broad sectors of the industry comprising mining, manufacturing, electricity and construction. Further is the investment intention. While GCF indicates actualization of investment intentions indicated in the industrial entrepreneur memorandums filed are lead indicators of likely investment flow to industry and of entrepreneurs' perception. The investment intentions also provide the sectoral preferences of investors and shifts in these preferences over time. Let us move further towards the second one, that is the FDI, or we call it as foreign direct investment. FDI being a non-debt capital flow in a leading source of external financing, especially for the developing economies. It not only brings in capital and technical know-how, but also increases the competitiveness of the economy. Overall, it supplements domestic investment much required for sustaining the high growth rate of the country. Next topic is the new steps to boost manufacturing. The GOI means the Government of India has taken several specific initiatives to strengthen industry, particularly the manufacturing sector. The 12th plan document lays down broad strategies for supporting industrial growth and recommends sector-specific measures covering micro, small, medium and large industries in the formal as well as informal sectors. Further is the National Manufacturing Policy. It was approved by the government in October 2011. The major objectives of the policies are: first, enhancing the share of manufacturing in the GDP to 25% and creating an additional 100 million additional jobs over a decade or so. Second, providing special focus to industries that are employment intensive, those producing capital goods, those having strategic significance, small and medium enterprises and public sector enterprises besides industries where India enjoys a competitive advantage. Third, promotion of clusters and aggregation. Especially through the creation of national investment and manufacturing zones. Let us move further. Fourth, out of 12 MINZs so far announced, 8 are along the DMIC. Besides, 4 other NIMZ have been given in principal approval to the Nagpur in Maharashtra, Tumkur in Karnataka, Chittoor district in Andhra Pradesh and Medak district in Andhra Pradesh. Let us study about this DMIC. DMIC means Delhi Mumbai Industrial Corridor. The industrial development initiatives under DMIC project presently 54 projects presently cover 8 industrial cities that are proposed to be developed along the railway corridor. The master planning for the investment regions and industrial areas are taken up initially to be developed as new cities in Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Haryana, Rajasthan and Maharashtra have been completed and master planning in Uttar Pradesh has started. The state governments have initiated the process of obtaining land for the new industrial regions or areas as well as for the early bird projects. Next is the FDI policy. Following the policy reform process, the FDI policy is being progressively liberalized on an ongoing basis in order to allow FDI in more industries under the automatic route. Some recent changes in FDI policy besides consolidation of the policy into a single document include FDI in multi-brand retail trading up to 51% subject to specified conditions, increasing FDI limit to 100% in single brand retail trading, FDI up to 49% in civil aviation and power exchanges, FDI up to 49% in the broadcasting sector under the automatic route and FDI above 49% and up to 74% under the government route both for teleports and mobile TV. Let us move further. The eBiz project. The government has announced the setting up of Invest India, a joint venture company between the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion and FICCI as a not-for-profit single window facilitator for prospective overseas investors, and to act as a structured mechanism to attract investment. In addition, the government has initiated implementation of the e-Biz project, a mission mode project under the NEGP, National E-Governance Plan, for promoting an online single window at the national level for business users. The objectives of setting up of the e-Biz portal are to provide a number of services to business users and covering entire life cycle for this operation. Next is the Indian infrastructure. An introduction. Infrastructure is the lifeline of an economy, as protein is the lifeline of the human body. Whichever sector be the prime moving force of an economy, that is primary, secondary or tertiary, suitable level of infrastructure presence is a prerequisite for growth and development. This is why the Government of India has always given priority to the developmental aspects of the sector. But the level of preparedness and performance had been always less than required by the economy. Which sector are called the infrastructure? Basically, the goods and services usually requiring higher investment considered essential for the proper functioning of an economy is called the infrastructure of an economy. Further is the next topic is the official ideology. Putting in place the quality and efficient infrastructure services is essential to realize the full potential of the growth impulses surging through the Indian economy. There is now a widespread consensus that exclusive dependence on the government for all provision of all infrastructure services introduces difficulties concerning adequate scale of investment, technical efficiency, proper enforcement of user charges and competitive market structure. At the same time, complete reliance on private production, particularly without appropriate regulation, is also not likely to produce optimal outcomes. Next is the sectoral situation and initiatives. First is the power deficit. The deficit in power supply in terms of peak availability and total energy availability declined during the 11th 5-year plan, while the energy deficit decreased from 9.6% in the terminal year of the 10th plan to 7.9% during April 2011 and December 2011. Peak deficit declined from 13.8% in 2006 and 7 to 10.6% during the current financial year, that is up to the December 2011. Next is the ultra mega power projects. Initiative for development of coal-based supercritical UMPPs, each of about 4,000 MW capacity under case 2 binding route. National Grid helps to even out supply-demand mismatches. The existing inter-regional transmission capacity of 23,800 megawatts connects the northern, western, eastern and northwestern region in a synchronous mode operating at the same frequency, and the southern region synchronously operating in the same mode. Let us move further. AT&C losses due to lack of adequate investment on transmission and distribution works. The T&D losses have been consistently on the higher side and reached to the level of 32.86% in the year 2000 and 2001. The reduction of these losses was essential to bring economic viability to the state-level utilities. As the T&D loss was not able to capture all the losses in the network, concept of aggregate technical and commercial, means AT&C loss, was introduced. AT&C loss captures technical as well as commercial losses in the network and is a true indicator of total losses in the system. Next is the development of multifunctional complex. A new concept of development of MFCs with budget hotels was introduced in the Rail Budget 2009 and 10, so that important facilities may be available to rail users in a separate complex in the vicinity of the circulating area on station. A total of 198 stations have been identified by now. Next is the National Highways Development Project. About 22% of the total length of national highways is single lane or intermediate lane, about 53% is 2-lane standard, and the balance 25% is 4-lane standard or more. Next is the Pradhan Mantri Gram Sadak Yojana, launched to provide single all-weather road connectivity to eligible unconnected habitations having population of 500 persons and above in plain areas and 250 persons and above in hill states, tribal areas, desert areas and LWE affected districts as identified by the Ministry of Homes. Next is the civil aviation. Airport infrastructure development continues to be a matter of concern. Upgradation of many airports, including construction of new terminals, upgradation in 18 non-metro airports for improving air navigation services, the Airport Authority of India installing the new ATS automation system. Maritime Agenda 2010 and 20. The objective of the Maritime Agenda 2010 and 20 is not only creating more capacity but setting up ports on a par with the best international ports in the terms of performance. First is the target of 3,130 empty port capacity has been set for the year 2020. This enlarged scale of operation is expected to reduce transaction cost considerably and make Indian ports globally competitive. Third is the proposed investment in major and non-major ports by 2020 in expected to be around rupees 2,96,000 crore. Fourth is the most of the investment to come from the private sector including FDI. Fifth is the private sector participation will not only increase investment in the ports infrastructure, it is expected to improve operations of the ports through the induction of the latest technology and better management practices. Sixth is the public funds will be mainly deployed for common use infrastructure facilities like deepening of port channels, railways and road connectivity from ports to hinterlands, etc. Further is the urban infrastructure. Jawaharlal Nehru National Urban Renewal Mission has been launched by the Ministry of Urban Development for a 7-year period to encourage cities to initiate steps to bring about improvements in a phased manner in existing civics service levels. Let us move further. Next is the urban transport. It is the one of the key elements of urban infrastructures as compared to private modes of transport. Public transport is energy efficient and less polluting. The public transport system helps improve urban-rural linkages and access of rural and or semi-urban population in the periphery to city centers for the purpose of work without proliferation of slums within or around cities. Next is the financing infrastructure. Net bank credit to infrastructure had a healthy growth of 42.4% per annum during 2006 and 11, but it turned negative in 2011 and 12 and was around 61% of 2010 and 11. Power and telecom sectors saw significant reduction. Next is the energy pricing. The economic role of rational energy pricing can hardly be underestimated. Rational energy prices provide the right signals to both the producers and consumers and lead to a demand-supply match, providing incentives for reducing consumption on the one hand and stimulating production on the other. Aligning domestic energy prices with the global prices, especially when large imports are involved, may be an ideal option as misalignment could pose both micro and macroeconomic problems. Next is the dedicated freight corridor. The Eastern and Western dedicated freight corridors are a mega rail transport project being undertaken to increase transportation capacity, reduce unit of cost of transportation and improve service quality. This is all about the concept of industry and infrastructure. Hope you like it. If you like, please subscribe. Thank you.